Ever looked at your tomato plant in the middle of summer and thought, what happened here? You started with this nice little transplant, and now it's a tangled jungle of leaves and stems. And the tomatoes themselves are smaller than you expected, if they're even ripening at all. Here's the thing. Most gardeners either skip pruning entirely, or they prune the wrong way for their type of tomato, and both mistakes will cost you a serious amount of fruit. In this video, I'm going to walk you through the complete process of pruning tomatoes the right way, from understanding whether you even should prune your variety, all the way through the exact cuts to make and when to make them. Plus, stick around to the end, where I'll show you a simple end-of-season technique that redirects all your plant's energy straight into ripening fruit, and how to turn your pruned suckers into free tomato plants. Let's get into it. Tomato pruning is probably the most debated topic in the entire gardening world, and for good reason. There's no single right answer that works for every plant. But here's the good news. Once you understand a few key concepts about how tomatoes actually grow, the pruning decisions become obvious. You'll know exactly what to cut, what to leave, and why. So let's start by understanding why we even bother pruning in the first place. Now, you don't technically have to prune your tomatoes. They'll grow without it. But I think anyone who's been growing tomatoes for a while would tell you that you really should. And here's why. Think about the leaves on your tomato plant as little energy factories. Each leaf is out there collecting sunlight and turning it into the energy your plant needs to produce those beautiful red fruits. That's their job. But here's the problem. When your tomato plant gets big and bushy, what happens to all those leaves on the interior of the plant? They're getting shaded out by the leaves above them and around them. They're not getting any sunlight, which means they're not producing any energy. I like to think of it like an office full of workers. If you've got employees who aren't producing anything, what happens to them? They get let go. And that's exactly what we're doing when we prune. We're letting go of the unproductive parts of the plant so the productive parts can thrive. But there's another huge benefit to pruning, and this one might be even more important. Air circulation. Tomatoes are susceptible to all kinds of diseases. Early blight, septoria leaf spot, various fungal issues. These problems absolutely love conditions that are humid, moist, and stagnant. When you've got a big, bushy tomato plant with leaves packed in tight, there's no air moving through there. It's like a sauna for disease. By pruning and opening up that plant, you're letting air flow through, and that alone can save you from a lot of heartache later in the season. One more benefit I'll mention. When you prune off the lower branches of your tomato plant, you create space underneath. That space stays clear of the soil, where disease often splashes up during watering or rain, and it also gives you room to interplant. I know gardeners who tuck lettuce or herbs right under their tomatoes once they've pruned up that lower canopy. So pruning isn't just about the tomato plant itself. It's about making your whole garden more productive. Now, before we talk about how to prune, we need to talk about what kind of tomato you're growing, because this changes everything. Your two main categories are determinate and indeterminate, and the names actually tell you a lot about how they behave. Determinate tomatoes have a determined height and lifespan. They grow to about 4 to 5 feet tall, and then they stop. The reason they stop is that their final bud at the very top of the plant is a flower bud. Once that flower bud forms, the plant has nowhere else to go. It's done growing upward. Now, this might sound like a limitation, but determinate tomatoes are fantastic for certain situations. They grow in a shorter, more defined season, and all the fruit tends to ripen at or near the same time. So if you're in a region with a shorter growing season, or if you want a bunch of tomatoes all at once for canning or sauce making, determinates are a great choice. They're also more compact, which makes them perfect if you're short on space or growing in containers. Indeterminate tomatoes are the opposite. As the name suggests, their growth is not determined. They don't have that terminal flower bud at the top, so they just keep growing and growing until something stops them, usually the frost in fall. If you're in a warmer climate with a longer growing season, indeterminates can be incredibly productive. I've seen people in mild climates grow tomatoes well into November, and some folks even overwinter their plants, which sounds crazy, but it happens. Now, you might also run into something called dwarf indeterminate. Tomatoes. These have been bred to have a compact growing habit, but technically, they're still indeterminate. For the purposes of pruning, I treat these like determinates because of their size. The key point here is that your pruning strategy depends entirely on which type you're growing. Prune a determinate the way you'd prune an indeterminate, and you'll cut off a huge portion of your harvest. So before you make a single cut, know what you're working with. Check your seed packet, look up the variety, and confirm whether it's determinate or indeterminate. Before you pick up your pruning shears, you need to understand the basic anatomy of a tomato plant. This is where a lot of gardeners go wrong. They start cutting without really knowing what they're cutting, and that's how you end up removing the wrong thing and hurting your harvest. So let's walk through this together. First, you have the main stem. This is the primary vertical growth of your plant, the trunk if you will. Everything else grows off of this main stem. Coming off the main stem, you'll see leaves. These are your sun leaves, and they're exactly what we talked about earlier. They're the energy factories soaking up sunlight and feeding the plant. You want to keep the healthy ones that are getting good light. Also coming off the main stem, you'll find flower buds. These are the clusters that will eventually become your tomatoes. You'll see little yellow flowers, and behind those flowers, the fruit starts to form. Obviously, these are precious. We don't want to remove these. Now here's the critical part. Between the main stem and a leaf, right in that joint where they meet, you'll often see another growth emerging at roughly a 45-degree angle. This growth looks like it could become its own little plant. It's got leaves forming, and if you look closely, it might even have the beginnings of a flower bud. This is called a sucker. Suckers are the key to understanding tomato pruning. On both determinate and indeterminate tomatoes, you'll see suckers forming in these joints. But here's what makes them so interesting and so important. Every sucker has the potential to become a whole new stem. It can grow leaves, produce flowers, and set fruit. It's like a clone of the main plant trying to branch off and do its own thing. I think of it like Medusa from the old myths. You cut off one head, and two more grow in its place. That's kind of how suckers work. If you let them go, they'll grow their own suckers, and suddenly you've got suckerception happening and your plant is out of control. Now the danger when you're pruning is that you might confuse a sucker for the main stem. Or worse, you might accidentally cut off the main growing tip, thinking it's a sucker. So here's how you confirm. Follow the plant upward from where you think the sucker is. If you see the main stem continuing up with more leaf nodes and flower buds above it, then yes, that 45-degree growth is a sucker. If you're not sure, don't cut. Wait a day or two and watch how it develops. It's always better to leave a sucker than to accidentally remove your main leader. Let's start with determinate tomatoes, because honestly, these are much simpler to prune. Remember, determinate varieties stop growing once they hit that terminal flower bud, so we need to be careful not to remove growth that's going to produce fruit. Here's the entire strategy for pruning a determinate tomato. First, locate the first flower bud on your plant. Look for the lowest cluster of flowers or developing fruit. Once you've found it, your job is simple. Remove any suckers that are growing below that first flower cluster. That's it. Everything below the first flowers can go. Everything above it you leave alone. The reason is straightforward. On a determinate tomato, every branch above that first flower cluster has the potential to produce fruit. If you start removing suckers above that point, you're literally deleting tomatoes from your harvest. You don't want to do that. Now, while you're down there removing those lower suckers, also take a look at any leaves that might be touching the ground. Leaves in contact with soil are an invitation for disease to splash up onto your plant. If you see any, go ahead and remove them. When it comes to actually making the cuts, the size of the sucker matters. If it's young and small, maybe just an inch or two long, you can simply pinch it off with your fingers. Just grip it at the base and snap it cleanly. This actually causes less damage to the plant than cutting because you're not leaving as much of an open wound. But if the sucker has gotten bigger, say 3 inches or more, you'll want to use clean pruning shears. And I do mean clean. Before you start pruning, wipe down your shears with rubbing alcohol or a diluted bleach solution. Diseases can spread from plant to plant on dirty tools, so take the 30 seconds to sterilize them. Once you've removed the suckers below the first flower cluster and cleaned up any ground-touching leaves, you're done with your determinate tomato. Just make sure you have some kind of support in place. Even though determinates are more compact, they still benefit from a cage or stakes to keep them upright as the fruit develops. If you're enjoying this video, you'll love my free weekly gardening guides. They go way deeper than I can here. Sign up free in the description and get one in-depth guide every week on getting your tomato care exactly right and maximizing your harvest. All right, let's continue. Now let's talk about indeterminate tomatoes, and this is where things get interesting because you have options. With indeterminates, you're not locked into one approach. You get to decide how you want to grow the plant, and your pruning strategy follows from that decision. First, let me mention what you could do, but probably shouldn't. You could just let an indeterminate tomato sprawl. Don't prune it at all. Let it run wild across the ground, or through whatever supports you have. The plant will survive and produce fruit. But you're going to deal with more disease because all that foliage is sitting in humid, stagnant conditions, often in contact with the soil. And you'll need a lot more horizontal space, so while it's technically an option, I don't recommend it. The better approach is to choose how many main stems, or leaders, you want your plant to have. This is where the real decision-making comes in. A single leader means you remove every sucker and maintain just one main stem growing upward. This gives you a very tidy, vertical plant. The fruit tends to be larger because all the plant's energy is focused on one stem, and it's easier to manage. A double leader means you let one sucker grow and become a second main stem. Now you have 2 vertical stems producing fruit. You'll get more tomatoes overall, but they might be slightly smaller than with a single leader. You can also go with 3 or even 4 leaders if you want a bushier, more productive plant. I wouldn't go past 4 though. At that point, you're not really gaining much benefit from pruning, and the plant becomes hard to manage. So how do you actually execute this? Let me walk you through the process the way I do it in my own garden. First, before you start selecting leaders, do a basic cleanup. Look at the lower part of your plant and remove anything that's clearly not serving you. Leaves that are smashing into the soil. Leaves that are showing signs of disease like yellowing or brown spots. Any growth that's just looking rough. Get rid of it. This isn't about the leader strategy yet. It's just housekeeping. Now identify your main stem. On a plant that's been growing for a while and hasn't been pruned, this can actually be tricky because it might look like a jungle in there. But your main stem is the one that started from the ground and has been growing upward the longest. Follow it with your eyes from the soil up, and you'll see where the suckers branch off versus where the main stem continues. Once you've identified the main stem, you need to find all the suckers. Remember, they're growing at that 45-degree angle in the joint between the stem and a leaf. On an unpruned plant, some of these suckers might be huge. They might have their own suckers growing off of them. Don't panic. Just start working through them systematically. Now here's where you make your choice. If you want a single leader, you remove every sucker you find. If you want a double leader, you pick one sucker to keep, ideally one that's strong and healthy and positioned where you want that second stem to go, and you remove all the others. For a triple leader, you keep 2 suckers, and so on. When I'm selecting which suckers to keep, I look for ones that are vigorous but haven't already started flowering. A sucker that's already got flowers on it has committed some of its energy to fruit production, which is fine, but a sucker that's still vegetative will put more energy into growing strong before it fruits. I also look at positioning. I want my leaders spaced out so they're not competing for the same light and air. Here's a confession that might make you feel better about your own garden. I often do this way too late. Life gets busy, and suddenly, that tomato plant I meant to prune 2 weeks ago has turned into a monster. If that happens to you, don't worry. Just get in there and do the work. It's better to prune late than not at all. But ideally, you want to stay on top of this throughout the season. Check your indeterminate tomatoes every week or so and pinch off new suckers while they're still small. It takes 30 seconds when they're tiny. It becomes a whole project when they're a foot long. One more thing as you're pruning. Save those suckers. Don't just throw them in the compost, at least not the healthy ones. Set them aside, because I'm going to show you what to do with them in just a minute. Let's talk about some common problems you might run into and how to handle them. First, and this is the one that causes the most panic, what if you accidentally cut off the main stem instead of a sucker? It happens. You're moving fast, the plant is bushy, and suddenly you realize you just removed the wrong thing. Take a breath. Your plant will recover. What'll happen is one of the remaining suckers will take over as the new main leader. You've essentially just forced the plant into a different growth pattern than you intended, but it will keep growing and producing fruit. Just pick the strongest remaining sucker and let that become your new leader. Second problem, you let things go too long, and now suckers have grown their own suckers and the whole plant is a tangled mess. This is suckerception, and it's overwhelming to look at. The solution is to just start somewhere and work methodically. Pick one stem, as a main leader, follow it upward, and remove suckers as you find them. Then move to the next section. You might not get the clean double or triple leader you wanted, but you can still open up the plant and improve air circulation. Do your best and commit to staying on top of it for the rest of the season. Third, you're seeing disease on the areas where you made cuts. This usually means your pruning shears weren't clean or you pruned when the plant was wet. Fungal spores love to enter through fresh wounds, especially in moist conditions. Going forward, always sterilize your tools before pruning and try to prune on dry days, ideally in the morning after any dew has evaporated. For the affected areas, remove any leaves or stems that are showing disease and dispose of them in the trash, not your compost. Fourth, you found a growth and you genuinely cannot tell if it's a sucker or a flower bud. This happens especially with younger plants. Here's the trick. Look at what's emerging from the growth. Suckers will quickly start producing leaves that look just like the other leaves on your plant. Flower buds will produce small yellow flowers or tiny green tomatoes. When in doubt, wait a day or two and check again. The growth will reveal itself. Fifth, you're not sure if your tomato is determinate or indeterminate. Maybe you lost the tag, or you're growing a variety from seeds a friend gave you. There are a few clues. Determinate tomatoes tend to be more compact and bushy. They set a lot of fruit at once, and the fruit ripens around the same time. Indeterminate tomatoes just keep getting taller. They produce fruit continuously throughout the season, rather than all at once. If your plant is over 5 feet and still putting out new growth at the top, It's almost certainly indeterminate. If you're still not sure, err on the side of less pruning. You can always remove more later, but you can't put back what you've cut. Now for that bonus I promised at the beginning. Actually, 2 bonuses. First, let's talk about those suckers you saved. If they're healthy, meaning no signs of disease, and they're not wilted or damaged, you can turn them into free tomato plants. This works because tomato stems have what's called totipotency. That's a fancy word that means the stem has the ability to produce roots along its entire length. So when you take a sucker and bury part of it in soil, it will root and become a whole new plant. Here's how to do it. Take your healthy sucker and remove the lowest leaf or 2. You want a few inches of bare stem at the bottom. Then simply bury that bare stem in moist potting soil, deep enough that it stands upright. Keep it watered and in a spot with bright indirect light for a few days. Within a week or 2, you'll see new growth, and you've got yourself a free tomato plant. This is especially valuable if you're in a warm climate where you can get a second crop going in late summer, or if you just want backup plants in case something happens to your main ones. Second bonus, end-of-season topping. This is the pruning technique that most gardeners never think about, but it can make a real difference in how many of your tomatoes actually ripen. Remember, indeterminate tomatoes will keep growing until the frost kills them. They don't know winter's coming. They'll keep putting out new leaves, new suckers, and new flowers right up until the end. But here's the problem. Those late-season flowers don't have time to become ripe tomatoes before the cold arrives. So the plant is spending energy on growth that will never pay off. Topping solves this. When you sense that the end of the season is approaching for your region, maybe 4 to 6 weeks before your first expected frost, you're going to do something that feels wrong. You're going to cut off the top of your tomato plant. That main growing tip that you've been protecting all season, you're going to remove it. I know it feels drastic, but here's what happens when you top the plant. You're sending a clear signal. No more vertical growth, no more new flowers. Instead, the plant redirects all that energy into the fruit that's already developing. Those green tomatoes that have been sitting there, they start ripening faster. You end up with more ripe tomatoes at the end of the season instead of a bunch of green ones that never matured. To top your plant, simply make a clean cut just above the last flower cluster you want to keep. The plant won't grow any taller after that. It might try to push out some suckers in response, so keep an eye out and remove any new growth. Your only goal at this point is ripening the existing fruit. I'll be honest, topping feels a little sad. You've been nurturing this plant all season, helping it grow big and strong, and now you're cutting off its head. But think of it as a kindness. You're helping the plant finish what it started. You're making sure all that work, all those months of watering and feeding and pruning, actually turns into tomatoes you can eat. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about growing the best tomatoes possible. I send one free, detailed gardening guide to your inbox every week. Link is in the description. You won't regret it. Tomato pruning has probably more opinions and strategies than any other gardening topic I can think of, and I'm still learning myself. If you've got a tip that's worked well for you, drop it in the comments. We're all learning together here. Until next time, good luck with those tomatoes.